With the announcement of new Apple Silicon Macs, it has come to our attention that the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro are both equipped with nearly identical M1 chips, and that has led to a lot of speculation. Is the MacBook Pro even relevant anymore? If it has the exact same internals as the Air, then why would you spend an extra $300 to get the benefits of the Pro? In today's video, we're going to go into extreme detail to figure out what the differences are, not just in terms of features and specifications, but in terms of performance between these two computers with the same chip. So this is the new M1 powered MacBook Pro. Yeah, I know, it's not much to look at. It's literally identical to the previous MacBook Pro, apart from the FN key. But what's really got everyone's attention is that what's on the inside of the MacBook Air appears to be the same as what's on the inside of the MacBook Pro, only the Air costs $300 less. At least, that's what it looks like on paper. If you compare spec sheets, there are more similarities than differences between the Air and the Pro. In the starting configurations, both come equipped with the M1, though the base Air has a 7-core GPU, 8GB of RAM, 256GB of storage, a 13.3-inch display, and a Magic Keyboard. Certainly the Pro doesn't look like $300 more just for that extra GPU core, but dig a little deeper and you'll notice that the Pro has a brighter display, noticeably better battery life, a touch bar for what that's worth, and most importantly, a fan. Okay, well the fan itself isn't really that important, it's what the fan entails. If you'll recall this famously vague graph from Apple's event, it shows the impressive performance of the M1 at 10 watts. However, you can clearly see the performance increasing as it goes past 10 watts. So with more power on tap and better thermal headroom, the MacBook Pro could offer more performance from the same chip. So does it? In Geekbench 5, the Air scores 7439 compared to 7660 on the MacBook Pro. In the GPU compute test with the metal preset, the Air gets 18,649 to the Pro's 21,837. In Cinebench R23, a much more demanding benchmark, the MacBook Pro outscores the Air 7779 to 6385, demonstrating its long-term capabilities from that active cooling. Moving on to Final Cut Pro, I rendered the same 10-minute, 10-bit 4K clip that I tested in the last video, and the MacBook Pro took 8 minutes and 57 seconds, 32 seconds faster than the MacBook Air, and shockingly, just 4 seconds slower than my 18-core iMac Pro that I paid $5,500 for. Blender also saw significant improvements, rendering the BMW benchmark in 6 minutes flat compared to 6 minutes 53 on the Air, and the Classroom render in 17 minutes and 2 seconds compared to 21 minutes and 21 seconds on the MacBook Air. You may have noticed that in the longer test, the MacBook Pro's margin of victory increases. This is one of the side effects of active cooling. The longer you go, the more noticeable it will be. And also remember that Blender hasn't been updated for Apple Silicon, so that's running through Rosetta emulation. Still, very impressive scores. So across the board, to varying degrees, the MacBook Pro is faster in every single test. And also it's worth noting that even though it does have a fan, in over an hour and a half of straight testing, often with the CPU completely pinned, I did not even hear the fan at all. To be honest, that's almost more impressive than the performance. The fact that you can go through back-to-back Cinebench runs and then switch over to Blender and do 30 minutes worth of rendering, and then switch over to Final Cut Pro and do some rendering and exporting, and then the computer's barely warm to the touch? Especially given Apple's less than stellar history with cooling. But let's say at this point you're kind of numb to performance numbers. They don't mean a whole lot to you. Why don't we put some of this in context? Well, here's a big old chart with a boatload of Cinebench R23 scores. There's a lot to unpack here, but take a look at where the M1 is falling. What do you notice? Well, Laptops are being smoked. The M1 MacBook Pro outperforms the base model 6-core 16-inch MacBook Pro, as well as a desktop Core i5 9600K, which has a TDP of 95 watts. We're then nipping at the heels of the i9 MacBook Pro, as well as yet more desktop processors in the 2020 iMacs. This is truly an incredible chart, especially when you realize the low wattage of this MacBook Pro's chip. So clearly the M1 is no slouch, and we are now comparing it to high-end 45-watt laptop processors and even 95-watt desktop processors. But comparing the Pro to the Air, you can definitely see that even with the same chip, you are going to get noticeably better performance on the MacBook Pro. And it's not just in terms of raw horsepower. The SSD on the MacBook Pro is also faster. It scores about 2200 megabytes per second read-write, compared to around 1500 on the MacBook Air, at least with the base storage. But I do want to take just a moment to revel in the comparison of the current MacBook Pro to its immediate predecessor. The new MacBook Pro is nearly doubling the performance in almost every metric, and it does all of this without breaking a sweat. Here's what an Intel MacBook sounds like halfway through a Cinebench run. And here's what the M1 MacBook sounds like at the exact same point. Oh, and did I mention that at that point in the test, the MacBook with the M1 processor had completed almost twice as many full runs as the Intel MacBook Pro? If you look at sped up footage of the M1 and the Intel chips running side by side, you can see the Apple Silicon just lapping Intel over and over again. I mean, heck, I was typing up the script for this video on the Intel 2020 MacBook Pro while I was running benchmarks on the Apple Silicon 2020 MacBook Pro. And the Intel one ran hotter just sitting in Pages than the Apple Silicon one did running Cinebench back to back. That's the level of performance and efficiency we're talking about here. It is simply mind-blowing. For the longest time, the argument with Apple products was that you weren't just buying a box full of specs. They might not be the most powerful, but they had great hardware, great software, and excellent optimization. Well, now Apple has absurdly powerful and extremely well-optimized hardware. It feels like a whole new Apple. And I know there will be comments saying, ooh, but Apple didn't change the designs. The bezels are still so thick. No. If your reason for not buying Apple Silicon is purely because you're upset about the thickness of the bezels, then you are wrong. That is a wrong opinion. Anyway, to get back on track here, if you're shopping between the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, you're definitely wondering what is observably better for the $300 extra you're spending to get the MacBook Pro. Well, there is a good amount. You are getting noticeably better performance, crucially more sustained performance, as well as the brighter display, noticeably longer battery life, and the touch bar. In my book, that's worth the extra money, but the Air is still a really good package at $1,000, especially given the amount of power that you're getting without a fan. You might also want to consider going for a MacBook Air with either the upgraded 16GB of RAM or 512GB hard drive for around the same price as the MacBook Pro. If storage is more important to you than performance, the Air is probably the better way to go. But more importantly, you can't really go wrong with either of these devices. For the first time in a long time, I really don't have any major caveats. I mean, sure, you could claim that repairability is sort of a big question mark with these things, and long-term, down the road, that could end up being a problem. We really don't have a whole lot of information on that right now, so I'm going to withhold judgment, but do be wary. There's also the issue of app compatibility, but personally, I don't think it's that big a deal. Sure, there might be a few apps that you use that don't quite work right, but the ones that do, even if you're running in emulation, chances are it's still going to run better emulated on Apple Silicon than it would have on Intel. So I definitely wouldn't go out and buy an Intel Mac just because your current apps are running in translation mode right now. And I also think it's worth noting that, when these MacBooks came out, a lot of people were saying, well, what the heck, you can only get them with 16 gigabytes of RAM, only 2 terabytes of storage. They only have 2 Thunderbolt ports, even on the Pro, and you can only connect it to one display. Yes, all of that might be seen as a downside, but it's also important to remember that these are still the entry-level models. None of that is worse than it was on the previous MacBooks, on the Intel MacBook Air and the Intel MacBook Pro, and there are still, obviously, much more powerful computers to come that will undoubtedly add more RAM, more displays, more Thunderbolt ports, in addition to significantly more power than what is already very powerful. I think a lot of people forgot when they saw these performance numbers that this is a $1,000 MacBook Air and a base model $1,300 MacBook Pro. They're not exactly meant to compete with the 16-inch, but they are because Apple Silicon is so amazing. So needless to say, there's a lot more testing to do. I still haven't even gotten the 2020 Apple Silicon Mac Mini, which I think is going to make for an interesting video. So make sure you're subscribed to catch that. But overall, these are just some fantastic laptops. Definitely make sure you're subscribed to see ongoing comparisons and testing and all sorts of content to do with these and other Mac products. And as usual, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider following me on Twitter at LukeMiani. And definitely check out my Twitch channel and my subreddit, which you'll find in the description below. And with that, I will see you all in the next video.